Okay, so generally, so this panel is going to respond to a key issue, how to reform institutions and how to construct endogenic societies in Africa, and during the clinic that we are going to have. So it's so let me start by saying that it's about to answer to an emergency, actually, to respond, and also to respond about the timing, the duration. So the urgent is actually about it. So actually, the emergency that we need to respond to is the fatigue that is happening. So we see people continue to vote each and every day, but we don't see the front. So we don't continue. So they talk about democracy. So we are having these narratives, to reclaim the authority that the powers be, and this is not happening. So we know that we are passing from dictators to dictators. That we expect to reform the democracy. So one dictator is actually succeeded by another dictator, and so I think the response is simple. The response is easy. I think we need really to talk about democracy, and this is to say that we need to find how we can remove and do the reform actually. In at least 50 years, and in these conditions, of course, we can see this panel took something that related to this, and we are actually proposing some foundation that is passing through a new wave of reform, of democratic reforms in Africa, and these reforms which can have some equivalent. So in 30 years to 60 years from now, and which we can form a new democratic spaces actually found within, which can be entitled of this which can also be in this white paper, and these that we need to form are actually the dimensions, dimensions that we got, and I'm trying to look at them, the four of them, and I'm going to present so very briefly, and I'm going to give the speech to something to mention, to contribute to each one of the issue. So it's about four pillars that we're going to have, and this is about reforms in Endogenous, in the development. So the government is used as a conduit, or something that we used as a channel, and these reforms. So reform of these of institutions and the power, and three is about electoral reforms, number 3, and lastly it's economic and societal reforms, because in free economy, I think we want not just in Africa but the whole world. So we have heard of people talking about social freedom, political freedom that is happening all over Africa and beyond, and that is about capitalism, economic capitalism. So concerning the first phase, the first part, so this is about government reforms. This is very simple. So you need now to pass to the external, to pass from exterior the models, to change them from the exterior to internal models that we need. So it means or actually having the restore, that is about the development, the capacity, capacity that we need to have, creative capacity to do and to manage the resources. So we need to know how to resolve our problems, our own problems, because the government says when we have a problem to resolve, so how do we solve this problem? So we need to have in the foundation it's actually done. So we need to make a 90-degree turning, so that we can have the development, the community development, which was taught by the capacity development, and also endogenous, so if it is construction, though the question of the issue of methods, the issue which we can have actually in endogenous manner, so that we can resolve the problems, we can resolve our problems efficiently. So that is it's about changing the methods, the methodology, and the other acts that we also need to look. It's actually reforming the powers and the procedures that we have. And here, the endogenous that we have concerns, if you want, maybe it's about the democracy space that we want to build. So it's about majority elections, looking to the 30 years ago, gone. It is the literature of political science. We have seen clearly that we have seen the model that a winner, will have everything, and that is always some inefficacy. For example, if you have that we have, maybe for example, a multinational or African, maybe which have maybe a fit like in Swiss, maybe, or ethnic group, maybe you can have in this ethnic group, or maybe you can find this election, the presidential elections, maybe the person who can govern alone can have fun, and so that is all the other.
They'll be excluded as waiting to win those elections one day. Of course, this leads to conflict and inefficacy. So that is not democracy. We need models that allow the permanent construction of alliances, bring all segments of the population together. This model is like, for example, consociative democracy. There's also a more radical model, which is called democracy, based on family and lineages. Coming from the ground, each has its own democracy. Selects a member to higher organs like the clan, and then it then sends another member to a higher level like the tribe or the village, and then the region, and then maybe the federal state, and then just until you get to the Pan-African level. So here we are talking about having structures that start from the top to the bottom, but we need endogenous models that bring up power from the grassroots to a higher level with democratic practices at each level. This is overall the regime of democratic institutions that we are proposing. And the models that we propose to go with this are such as elections that would be very different from the majority democracy, which is winner take all and loser loses everything, or where one group wins and the other loses. The electoral models that are win-win. For example, we thought of a model like universal suffrage, where everybody is asked to vote, including children, all the dependents, using family structured voting. So I'm going to try not lose a lot of time. Let's use the next slide. So, institutions like preferable votes or witness votes. I talked about universal suffrage. There's another structure which could be the preferential voting, which instead of having debate between candidates where one party wins and the other loses in an exclusive manner, electors could have different scores: first winner, second winner, third winner, and then at that point they will make the candidates and the parties to come together so that the second ranked party could join the third or the first, so that we avoid violence of a crisis and have alliances, even during the campaign, to speak to everybody, address everything, so that when this sharing of power, which is permanent, everybody is represented, and that the co-responsibility is not just belonging to the government in power. We should also reform the economy so that we democratize the economy itself. So we need endogenous economic models which are more geared towards prosperity for the grassroots level. We could talk about a village. If poor people have the capability to decide on the creation of wealth at their level, at that point in time we could have universal dignity. I'm going to stop there so that I allow my colleagues to give us more. They'll have 5 minutes each. We'll start with a talk on reform on the principle of governance based on not on lack, but more about indigenous sharing. Thank you very much. You just said in your introductory remarks that the alternative to democracy is more democracy. So if we want to reform our democratic institutions, we need to try and think about this and not reject those matters. When you talk about a crisis in our democratic institutions, we need to think about what comes to mind, the expressions of this crisis, which is the weakness of counterparties, authoritarianisms, and corruption. So there's a question which is very important and which has been neglected to date, which is the question of discussion. I think the crisis we face is based on a crisis on lack of political speech, because we do not come up with a conception on this, but we have agonistic models, and we are talking about convincing, winning, despite the fact that African traditional societies had discussion models that were based on using political speech as a sort of therapy, which made it such that the adversary was not mistreated. It was a system in which we integrated all views in the group, so that conflicts that were being brought out were owned by the people. Discussions in what we talked about with what we call palabre in West Africa was an institution that could be used as a model. It's an extremely important institution because it brought out some ethics in discussions that was based on rationality of dialogue which is nothing that we see today in our parliaments, because it developed a mode of mutual respect and explained the fact that when one wanted to go to debate against another person, we used verbal mediation and used things like proverbs and figurative language, so that we don't hurt the other party. Because if we brutally contradict someone in public, it could hurt the person's dignity. So there are technical aspects in dialogue which are very important. I don't want to idealize these traditional African societies, but we need to use their practices to rethink about our own practices and come up with some dynamism. I think that at this level there are three things that we should revisit. The first principle is thinking that with these alliances that make democracy as it has become today a set of institutions linked to neoliberalism, and that's why societies are being run like startups. The time of dialogue has become very short. We need to take time to have longer dialogues, but it may look like a waste of time, but it's very important, because society has to resolve problems, and they need to produce models that preserve individuals' self-esteem. Another thing that is important is that we need to understand that this logic of the majority being the winner is not enough to bring out theoretical legitimacy. 51% who impose their views on 49% is not equitable. We need to have models of public understanding which would have their objective as giving power back to the people, and this is what we need to think about constructing. Bien, qu'est-ce que vous pensez sur comment approfondir ces réformes par rapport au niveau institutionnel, le pouvoir et des élections aussi? Est-ce que le micro est... Merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité.
Everyone here. Let me first state that I am deeply honored to have been invited to this roundtable. It is truly a pleasure to share the stage with my distinguished colleagues here. I also want to point out that I am immensely grateful to the Foundation for all the work that it's doing. This gratitude goes, of course, beyond this amazingly rich one-day event and the Africa Forward Summit as such. It's also about the consultation process, information gathering work, and the fact-finding about Africa leading up to this that has taken place across the continent for years. I underline the work that has been done here and the time it has taken, as both this process undertaken by the Foundation and also the document penned by Jean-Eudes Biem underlines my main point, namely that high speed is very often the enemy of democracy. Conversely, what the Foundation has done is to steadily build conceptual frameworks for rethinking what endogenous democracy on the continent may look like, using time and thereby allowing potential in its many forms to emerge. In line with the work of the Foundation and in the spirit of this pavilion of creation, of solidarity, inclusion, and generativity. Put differently, if we create conditions for democratic patience, democratic polyarchal models may emerge. Polyarchy, that is that no one should decide alone on matters concerning the common good should be a fundamental aspect of building endogenous democracy. This is beautifully argued in the document underlining this roundtable, and the fuel of such a process is time. Second, I would like to underline that the richness of experimental models and recognition of African resources here is essentially also an argument against the erosion of time by fast capitalism, fast business, and real-time algorithms. For there is a sense that the future has already been predefined by capitalism, fast business, or algorithms preempting or anticipating your every move. It's imperative to pause these calls for urgency, high speed, and pushes for fast decisions if democratic patience is to be learned, experimented with, and implemented. For we have to remember, urgency is sometimes a very effective cover-up for non-democratic processes, including populist politics of alarmism, exclusion, xenophobia, and also power grabbing. Urgency may then very often be the opposite of polyarchy and allowing for experiments with endogenous democracy. Third, reconquering time as democratic patience is also to allow for a flourishing of different forms of beings and becomings of both humans and non-humans. Such flourishing reflects what climate change demands of us. However, flourishing also reflects two other important dimensions of building endogenous democracy from below. That is both traditional and innovative forms of engagement with the natural environment and wider society. For memory, traditional knowledge, and intergenerational creativity to be relevant, there needs to be time to allow it to emerge. So in sum, we need to have the importance of time as integral to democratic patience in mind if we are to work towards the goal of polyarchy, defined, again, as the traditional African principle that no one ever decides alone for the common good. Further, sharing processes over time is also a mechanism harnessing the enormous solidaristic potential and practices existing at especially the local level in African contexts. Now, I was asked by Jean to also reflect on Scandinavian models, but I don't know if there is
For
time.
a minute.
Exactly a minute,
if possible.
And I'm hesitant to bring in these. I would just like to underline that there is a particular slowness to democratic processes at the local level in Scandinavian systems that might be good to think with, as we anthropologists like to say. For in these contexts, local municipal councils move slowly, as do bureaucratic and political processes relating to land, to individual property, to natural commons, to public space. Sometimes, of course, slowness is a source of frustration, but it also works to build trust and ultimately democratic patience. I cannot go into further details here about my work in Mozambique, but I do hope I've been able to underline my main point, namely that one needs to allow time, generate time, rethink time for polyarchic and endogenous democratic experimentation to be able to unfold at all. For the institutional, cultural, linguistic, and political potentials are truly there, as also pointed out by Professor Bashir Diagne in his opening statement today.
Thank you very much, Bjern. We are going to proceed with Madame Kessy Ekomo. The lady should not come last. Our host, who is Demas, who is here at home, will close the session.
Merci infiniment, bonjour à tous. Donc je suis Kessy Ekomo de la République centrafricaine. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici et je pense que...
I'm very happy to be here, and these elements that have been presented by my different colleagues, I will not repeat what they've said, but I'll just move straight to the point that economic reform is what we are talking about today. So I had the luck of being the vice president of an organization in Central Africa, and I've always been impressed by the dialogues on governance and economic questions. But our voices do not connect with the private sector. So this public private dialogue does not exist, So we need to reformulate these questions and think about the national economy. So what impressed us in our governance structure is that we think about reforms, and we are always thinking about how to challenge big institutions like World Bank so that they reflect what we are thinking at the national level. And it's important to change their conception of actions that are going on in the countries. And these are I'm talking about Central African Republic, and these are things that are happening. But these are discussions that we've had with colleagues in the sub-region from Cameroon and Chad and DRC. And we always say that the way we talk about our own economies, we don't align with the world economy. So we tend to define our ideas, but we don't take into account the fact that we exist in a larger ecosystem, and we need to think about things in that context. So, in the big meetings at the world level, the African voice is not really heard. And that is when we talk about reforms. And so when I talk about institutional challenges, we need to be more audible. We need to come with proposals that are based at challenges at our local level and work in a way that we can resonate and have echoes in these ecosystems. Second point that I would like to highlight is the question on perception. When I was talking about challenging the ecosystem and international institutions, we realized together with colleagues from the private sector that when you talk about rethinking about our economy and thinking about being more endogenous, how do we define our actors? I'm thinking about small, medium enterprises. It's not the same way they are defined by the World Bank. We don't understand each other. That's a problem. Even when we talk about tools, if we use their definitions, they'll bring us tools and approaches that will not benefit our own SMEs. So I think that it is a question of influence, and it's also a question of through our own definition of we need to bring out our own definitions and talk about our actors. If we're talking about SME CAR, how do we define them? It's different from one country to the other, and this global universal definition does not serve us well. We need to reform this. So I'm also thinking about our populations, our people. I'm going to give us a more complex illustration. In my country, think tank is something that we try to do because we are a country in reconstruction. We've had several years of conflict. There are several international actors, and each one comes with their own model to change things. And we thought it was very important for us to test models. And I think even if before we talk about reforms, we need to test our own models at the national level so that we have enough elements to convince others that we can do things otherwise. I'm going to stop there and pass the microphone to my colleagues. Premièrement, on va entendre Demas par rapport à la réforme du système électoral. Merci beaucoup. D'abord, je suis en train de lire le livre blanc, c'était bien, et les idées sont très réfléchissantes. Et ils donnent un bon diagnostic de questions de démocratie en Afrique, surtout quand on soulève le fait que les élections sont que des événements, et c'est là où ceux qui veulent être élus se représentent. Le public ne connaît rien de ces jeunes-là, à part de leur identité et les ressources qu'ils ont. Et cela traduit à une procédure qui est malsaine, où on élit des gens, on a des élections qui se passent, mais il n'y a pas de changement pour la population. Donc, ce qu'on a proposé de mettre en place ou inclure des enfants est très important puisqu'on comprenne bien que les décisions que nous prenne comme des adultes vont impacter à des ressources qui sont limitées, qui ont des impacts sur l'environnement et sur les crédits dans le futur. Donc on doit chercher des modèles dans lesquels les modèles auront leur voix exprimée. Donc cette question de élections.
And I think Australia has this model where everyone is required to vote because really the decisions that are made in elections affect everything, affect how your life is going, your trajectory of your life for the next 5 or 7 years. It also proposes that for any constitutional amendment, there is that requirement of a referendum. And it got me thinking because sometimes there are constitutional amendments that are not that far-reaching, and so perhaps we can consider ring-fencing certain things. So, for example, if you want to change term limits, if you want to change judicial independence or human rights issues, maybe that is when we need to go back to the plebiscite. But indeed, elections in Africa are becoming quite disillusional because the data is out there that some people are even losing hope on democracy as a model. And so perhaps, I can see the timekeeper is on me.
Time's up.
Yeah.
Do take a minute.
Yeah, and so how do we harness our identity as Africans, our systems, to enrich democracy that ensures that our dignity and that our societies thrive, and not forgetting that even as we harness our African systems, perhaps we should also be careful not to bring in things such as patriarchy, so that we ensure that we have gender parity in our systems. Thank you.
And thank you for your attention.